That old woman is the maid. My daughter-in-law told the grocery store clerk without even lowering her voice. Don't waste time talking to her. The young cashier froze with a carton of eggs in her hands while I stood beside the shopping cart, gripping the handle so tightly my fingers ached. For a moment, all I could hear was the low hum of refrigerators and the distant squeak of shopping carts rolling across polished tile. Vanessa didn't look embarrassed. She didn't even look angry. She said it the same way someone might comment on the weather. Casual. Dismissive. Final. I smiled politely at the cashier because I suddenly understood she was more uncomfortable than I was. Paper bags are fine, I said softly. My voice sounded calm. Older. Smaller somehow. Vanessa pulled out her platinum card and sighed dramatically while checking her phone. Make sure the flowers stay upright, she told me as if I worked for her. Around us, shoppers pretended not to listen. Americans are polite like that. They stare without staring. I carefully lifted the bouquet of white hydrangeas from the conveyor belt and placed them back into the cart beside the imported sparkling water and organic strawberries Vanessa insisted the children would only eat. We were shopping for Sunday dinner at the house. Or at least that's what Vanessa still called it. The house no longer felt like mine, even though my late husband had built it 40 years ago with his own hands. Richard used to joke that the cedar beams in the living room carried his fingerprints permanently sealed into the wood. Now the walls were painted white and gray. Cold colors. Vanessa said the old wallpaper made the house look dated. Most of Richard's photographs had disappeared too. The framed picture from our trip to Maine. Gone. The wedding portrait from 1979. Gone. Even the old clock Richard's father repaired every Christmas had vanished from the hallway. Vanessa replaced it with abstract artwork that looked like spilled ink. The cashier handed me the receipt instead of Vanessa. Her cheeks were pink with embarrassment. Have a nice afternoon, ma'am, she whispered carefully. Vanessa laughed under her breath before the girl could walk away. You're sweet, she said. But trust me, she's happier organizing cabinets than having conversations. The cashier glanced at me one last time. I gave her another smile because dignity becomes a strange kind of armor when you get older. You learn how to survive humiliation quietly. Outside, the October air carried the sharp smell of rain and fallen leaves. Vanessa clicked her car remote, and the black Mercedes SUV blinked beneath the gray afternoon sky. She handed me the lighter bags without asking. Be careful with the cake, she said while slipping on oversized sunglasses. The bakery charged almost $80 for it. I nodded and placed the cake carefully into the back seat. My reflection appeared briefly in the tinted window beside hers. Vanessa looked polished and expensive in her cream wool coat and gold earrings. I looked like exactly what she had called me. An old woman carrying groceries. The drive home was silent except for Vanessa speaking occasionally into her Bluetooth headset about centerpieces and seating charts for an upcoming charity dinner. She spoke in the polished voice she reserved for wealthy friends and social committees. Warm, elegant, controlled. Not once did she mention what happened inside the store. Not once did she apologize. Halfway home, she suddenly lowered the volume on the radio. By the way, she said casually, keeping her eyes on the road. Please don't tell Ethan about little jokes like that. You know how sensitive he gets. Little jokes. I turned toward the passenger window and watched red and gold leaves blur past us. Ethan used to notice everything about me when he was young. When he was 6 years old, he cried because a waitress forgot my coffee refill at a diner in Vermont. My mom's still waiting, he had told her with genuine heartbreak in his voice. Now he barely noticed when Vanessa interrupted me at dinner, or corrected me in front of guests, or introduced me simply as Helen instead of his mother. Grief changes families in quiet ways. After Richard died 2 years earlier, I thought we would hold each other closer. Instead, it felt as though Vanessa slowly began erasing every trace of the life I once had inside that house. Sometimes I wondered whether Ethan even saw it happening. The Mercedes stopped at a red light near the town square. Vanessa checked her lipstick in the mirror. You know, she said lightly, people respond to confidence. That cashier probably assumed you worked for me because of your energy. I looked down at my hands folded neatly in my lap. The wedding ring Richard gave me 50 years ago still rested on my finger. I had stopped correcting people about many things lately. My age, my grief, my place in that family. But as Vanessa adjusted her silk scarf and smiled faintly at her own reflection, something cold settled quietly inside me for the first time. Not anger, Not sadness. Clarity. Because the worst part wasn't that my daughter-in-law called me a maid in public. The worst part was realizing she truly believed I had already become one. The house stood at the end of Maple Ridge Drive exactly the way it always had. Tall white columns facing the street, copper lanterns beside the front door, flower beds carefully trimmed before winter arrived. From the outside, it still looked like the kind of home people slowed down to admire while driving past. But homes can change long before the walls do. Vanessa parked in the circular driveway and handed me the bakery box without looking at me. "Please put that in the kitchen," she said while checking messages on her phone. "And do not leave it near the stove this time." I carried the cake carefully through the front door. The foyer smelled faintly of eucalyptus candles Vanessa burned year-round because she claimed they made the house feel like a luxury hotel. The scent covered everything now, even memories. I walked slowly into the kitchen and stopped for a moment beside the long marble island Richard once insisted was unnecessary. "Nobody needs a kitchen this large," he used to laugh while measuring cabinet space with a tape measure clipped to his belt. He eventually built it anyway because he loved watching our family gather there during holidays. Now the kitchen looked untouched most of the time, too perfect to feel lived in. I placed the cake carefully inside the refrigerator beside. Labeled glass containers Vanessa prepared every Sunday evening. Kale salad, fresh berries, almond milk creamer. Everything neat. Everything controlled. Upstairs, I could hear footsteps crossing the hallway. My grandson Tyler ran halfway down the staircase holding a basketball under his arm. He paused when he saw me. "Hey, Helen," he said quickly before heading toward the garage. "Helen, not Grandma anymore." Vanessa said formal names help children develop independence. At first I corrected him gently, then less often, then not at all. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the garage door open and close again. Somewhere along the way, I had become a guest in the house where I raised my son. I walked into the living room and noticed another change. Richard's leather reading chair was gone. In its place stood a pale gray accent chair that looked expensive and deeply uncomfortable. I touched the empty space beside the bookshelf where his chair used to sit every winter near the fireplace. It was outdated, Vanessa had explained last month while directing movers around the room. The house needs a cleaner aesthetic. Cleaner. That word stayed with me, as though traces of my husband needed to be removed one piece at a time. I sat carefully on the edge of the sofa and folded my coat beside me. Outside, thin rain tapped softly against the windows. The grandfather clock from Richard's father still should have chimed at 4 o'clock. Silence answered instead. Vanessa had sent it away for restoration nearly 8 months earlier. It never came back. A few minutes later, she entered the room carrying shopping bags filled with decorations for the charity gala she planned to host in December. Gold ribbons spilled from one of the bags onto the floor. "Do you mind polishing the silver serving trays tomorrow?" she asked casually. "The housekeeper only comes on Thursdays now." I looked up slowly. "Of course," I said. Vanessa smiled absently, already distracted by her phone again. "You always notice details people miss," she replied. "That is your gift." For some reason, that hurt more than the grocery store. Because years ago Richard used to say something similar while wrapping his arm around my shoulders during dinner parties. "Helen makes this house feel alive," he would tell guests proudly. Same house, same woman, different meaning. I glanced toward the hallway mirror near the staircase. My reflection looked smaller lately. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone fading gently at the edges while everyone else continued speaking over her. Upstairs, I heard Ethan's footsteps returning home from work. Vanessa immediately brightened. Her voice softened. Warm laughter floated through the hallway as she greeted him at the door. I remained seated quietly in the living room while rain continued falling outside. Nobody asked about my afternoon. Nobody noticed I had barely spoken since we came home. And for the first time in my life, sitting inside the house Richard built for our family, I realized loneliness feels heavier when you are surrounded by people who have already decided you no longer belong. The next morning began the same way most mornings did now. Quiet footsteps upstairs. The sound of the espresso machine humming in the kitchen. Cabinet doors opening and closing softly while the rest of the house remained half asleep. I woke before sunrise out of habit after 46 years of marriage. Richard always rose early, even on Sundays. He used to stand on the back porch with a cup of black coffee, watching fog settle over the yard while the newspaper rested beneath his arm. Sometimes I still expected to hear his footsteps outside my bedroom door. Grief does strange things to memory. It keeps ordinary moments alive longer than you expect. I folded my blanket neatly and walked downstairs wearing a cream cardigan Richard bought me during a trip to Vermont almost 20 years earlier. The kitchen lights were already on. Vanessa sat at the island reviewing guest lists on her tablet while drinking green juice from a tall glass bottle. She glanced at me briefly before returning to the screen. "Good morning," I said softly. "Morning," she answered without looking up. The silence afterward stretched awkwardly across the room. I opened the cabinet for a coffee mug and noticed all the floral china had disappeared. Only white ceramic. Cups remained lined neatly on the shelves like hotel dishes. Vanessa noticed me searching. "I donated the old mugs last week," she explained casually. "Nobody was using them." I paused with my hand still resting on the cabinet door. "Richard gave me those mugs one Christmas after I admired them in a small antique shop outside Boston. Tiny blue flowers circled the edges. Delicate gold trim around the handles. One had chipped years ago, and Richard refused to throw it away because he said imperfections proved something had been loved properly. I poured coffee into one of the plain white cups and sat quietly near the window. Outside, rainwater still clung to the maple trees from the night before. Vanessa continued typing quickly. "For the luncheon next week," she suddenly said, "I think it is best if you stay upstairs until guests settle in." I looked at her carefully. "Why?" She finally raised her eyes toward me and smiled politely. "You know how social events are? Some women can be judgmental. I just want everything to feel polished." Polished again. That word. Everything in Vanessa's world needed to appear polished. Controlled. Young. Expensive. Human beings included. "I understand," I replied quietly. And strangely I did. Because over the past 2 years I had started understanding Vanessa more clearly than Ethan ever did. She did not hate me. Hatred requires emotion. Vanessa simply viewed people the way interior designers view furniture. Useful things stayed. Outdated things disappeared. Around 8 o'clock, Ethan walked into the kitchen adjusting the cuffs of his dress shirt. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek before grabbing a protein bar from the counter. "Morning, Mom," he said distractedly. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Work emails. Meetings. Deadlines. He barely looked at me anymore when we spoke. Vanessa slid a folder toward him. "I updated the seating arrangements for the charity gala," she said smoothly. "The Whitakers confirmed they are attending." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly while scrolling through his phone. "Great." Then he turned toward me briefly. "Mom, are you doing okay? You seem quiet lately." The question almost startled me because it sounded sincere. Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed softly. "Helen is always quiet in the mornings," she said. "That is why the house feels peaceful." Ethan smiled faintly, already distracted again. "Right." He kissed Vanessa once more and headed toward the garage. The front door closed behind him seconds later. Vanessa continued reviewing her guest list calmly, as if nothing important had just happened. But something inside me shifted while I watched her sitting there beneath the soft kitchen lights. Because for the first time, I realized she no longer interrupted me by accident. She did it deliberately, gently, skillfully, like someone slowly lowering the volume on another person's existence until eventually nobody remembers they were speaking at all. By Thursday afternoon, the house no longer smelled like eucalyptus candles. It smelled like fresh lilies, polished silver, and expensive perfume drifting in from women who arrived carrying designer handbags and carefully rehearsed laughter. Vanessa's luncheon had become one of the most talked-about social gatherings in our town over the past few years. Wealthy wives from country clubs and charity boards filled the dining room, wearing cream-colored coats and diamond earrings that caught the light whenever they turned their heads. I stayed upstairs exactly as Vanessa requested while cars lined the driveway below. From the guest bedroom window, I watched women step carefully over the wet stone walkway in high heels, while valet attendants opened car doors beneath gray autumn skies. Their laughter floated upward through the cold air. I sat quietly in the small reading chair beside the window with a book open in my lap that I had not actually read for nearly 20 minutes. Downstairs, I could hear dishes clinking softly and Vanessa greeting guests with effortless warmth. She was talented at that, making people feel welcomed, special, chosen. "You made it," I heard her say brightly through the staircase opening. "The house has been chaos all morning." Women laughed politely below. Another voice answered, Everything looks absolutely stunning, Vanessa. I closed the book slowly. Years ago, those same compliments belonged to Richard and me together. We hosted fundraisers, Christmas dinners, scholarship events. Richard always stood near the fireplace holding a glass of bourbon while introducing me proudly to every guest who entered our home. Helen makes this place beautiful, he used to say. Back then, I believed kindness created loyalty inside families. I was wrong. Around 1 o'clock, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. Vanessa stepped inside wearing a fitted ivory dress with pearl earrings that matched the bracelet on her wrist. She smiled politely when she saw me. "The caterer is running behind," she said. "Would you mind helping downstairs for a little while?" Her tone sounded gentle, almost apologetic, but I noticed she did not actually wait for my answer. She simply glanced at my sweater and added, "Maybe wear something darker. Red draws attention in photographs." I looked down at the burgundy cardigan folded neatly across my lap. Richard bought it for me on our anniversary 5 years earlier because he said the color made me look elegant. "Of course," I replied quietly. 10 minutes later, I stood in the kitchen arranging dessert plates while conversations drifted in from the dining room. Vanessa moved effortlessly between guests carrying wine glasses and complimenting handbags while soft jazz music played through hidden speakers. Nobody noticed me at first. Then one woman near the hallway smiled warmly in my direction. "Excuse me," she said kindly, reaching into her purse. "Could you take our photo?" She held out her phone naturally, comfortably, as though there were no question about who I was. For one strange second, nobody corrected her. Not Vanessa, not the other women seated nearby. Silence settled softly across the room before Vanessa laughed lightly and touched the woman's arm. "Helen helps me with everything around here," she explained smoothly. "I would completely fall apart without her." The women smiled politely. One even nodded approvingly as though Vanessa had said something generous. I took the photograph carefully anyway. For women standing beneath the chandelier Richard installed himself one winter nearly 20 years ago. After handing the phone back, I returned quietly toward the kitchen carrying an empty tray. My reflection caught briefly in the dark dining room window as I passed. Small, silent, useful. Somewhere behind me, women resumed talking about charity auctions and vacation homes in Nantucket. Nobody noticed when I stopped walking for a moment beside the hallway table where Richard's photograph used to stand before Vanessa redecorated the house. My chest tightened unexpectedly then, not because strangers mistook me for hired help, but because inside my own home, I had started accepting it too. The luncheon ended shortly after 3 o'clock. One by one, the luxury cars disappeared down Maple Ridge Drive, while the house slowly returned to silence. Crystal glasses sat half empty across the dining table beside folded linen napkins stained faintly with lipstick. The caterers carried trays through the kitchen, while Vanessa stood near the front door thanking guests with polished warmth that never seemed to fade. I remained mostly invisible through all of it. By then I had become skilled at disappearing quietly inside my own home. After the last guest finally left, I carried a stack of dessert plates toward the kitchen sink. My lower back ached from standing most of the afternoon, but I said nothing. Vanessa entered behind me, removing her earrings with an exhausted sigh. "Overall, I think it went beautifully," she said while checking herself in the reflection of the microwave door. "People notice details at events like this." I rinsed a plate carefully beneath warm water. "I am glad everything worked out," I answered. Vanessa leaned against the marble counter and crossed her arms loosely. "You know," she said after a moment, "you could help yourself a little more socially." I turned off the faucet slowly. "What do you mean?" She hesitated just long enough to make the next sentence sound thoughtful instead of cruel. "Sometimes your energy feels heavy around people. You look sad often. Guests pick up on that." I stared down at soap bubbles circling the sink drain. Heavy energy. That was how she described grief now. As if losing Richard after nearly 5 decades together had become some embarrassing social habit I needed to control better for company. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Vanessa frowned lightly and glanced toward the hallway. "Can you get that?" she asked distractedly while opening the refrigerator. I dried my hands carefully and walked toward the front door. Outside stood the young cashier from the grocery store. Claire. She held a small white bakery box tied with blue ribbon. For a second, she looked nervous seeing me answer the door. "I am sorry to bother you," she said quickly. The bakery accidentally gave us your lemon tart with another order yesterday. I offered to drop it off after work. I blinked in surprise. That was very kind of you. Claire smiled politely before lowering her voice slightly. I also wanted to apologize for what happened at the store. My chest tightened faintly. You do not need to apologize. Maybe not, she said softly, but I kept thinking about it anyway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Cold autumn wind moved through the porch columns behind her. Then Claire glanced past me into the house and added carefully, "You remind me of my grandmother. People treated her differently after my grandfather passed away too." I looked at her more closely then. Young, honest, uncomfortable with cruelty in the way decent people usually are. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means more than you probably realize." Before leaving, Claire hesitated once more near the bottom step. "I know this is none of my business," she said cautiously, "but your daughter-in-law talks about this house sometimes at the store when she shops. Mostly with her friends." My fingers tightened slightly around the bakery box. "What kind of things?" Claire looked embarrassed immediately. I probably should not repeat it. "Please." She exhaled softly. "She keeps saying once certain paperwork is finalized, the property will finally feel like hers completely." The world seemed to still for one strange second. Somewhere inside the house, I could hear Vanessa laughing at something on her phone. Claire shifted awkwardly. "I am sorry. Maybe I misunderstood." But I knew she had not. After she left, I stood alone on the porch holding the bakery box against my coat while cold wind moved through the empty driveway. Finalized paperwork. The words echoed quietly in my mind all evening. Richard handled most financial matters before he died. Trusts, investments, property taxes, legal documents stacked neatly inside his office downstairs. After his funeral, Vanessa insisted Ethan should take over everything because it was too stressful for me. At the time, I agreed without question. Grief makes trusting people feel easier than thinking clearly. Slowly, I looked back through the front windows of the house Richard built for our family. Vanessa stood laughing beneath the chandelier while rearranging flower arrangements from the luncheon. Elegant, comfortable, already at home. And for the first time since Richard died, a quiet thought entered my mind that refused to leave. What if losing my place in this family had never been accidental at all? The next morning I woke before anyone else and walked quietly downstairs wearing slippers against the cold hardwood floors. Outside, dawn had barely touched the sky. Thin blue light rested over the backyard, and the maple trees stood motionless in the early silence. For years this had been my favorite hour inside the house. Before noise, before schedules, before people started pretending. I stood alone in the kitchen making coffee the way Richard liked it, strong and black, even though nobody drank it that way anymore. Vanessa preferred herbal tea in delicate glass cups. Ethan lived on expensive espresso pods and protein shakes. Somewhere along the way, even the smell of the mornings had changed. I carried my coffee slowly toward Richard's old office at the end of the downstairs hallway. The door had remained mostly untouched since his funeral because Vanessa claimed the room felt too depressing to redesign immediately. That alone now struck me as strange. She changed everything else quickly. The wallpaper, the furniture, the photographs, but not the office. I pushed the door open carefully. Dust floated through pale morning light near the windows. Richard's leather desk chair still faced the bookshelf exactly the way he left it the week before he died. His reading glasses rested beside an old fountain pen near the desk lamp. For a moment my chest tightened so sharply I almost stepped back out of the room. Grief arrives differently when objects remain still for too long. I sat carefully in the chair across from his desk and wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. The silence felt heavier there, honest somehow. My eyes drifted toward the lower filing cabinet Richard always kept locked. I suddenly remembered something Claire said the evening before. Finalized paperwork. I stared at the cabinet for a long moment before opening the top desk drawer slowly. Inside lay old receipts, stationery, batteries, and a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. Richard's handwriting covered the tag in neat blue ink. Office cabinet. I froze completely. The key felt strangely cold in my hand. For 2 years I had accepted every explanation Vanessa offered without question because grief exhausted me too deeply to think clearly. Ethan handles the finances now. The attorneys already reviewed everything. Do not stress yourself with paperwork. Looking back, I realized how carefully those sentences had been repeated around me. Softly, patiently, like instructions given to someone fragile. I slid the key carefully into the cabinet lock. The drawer opened with a quiet metallic click. Inside sat several thick folders arranged neatly beside a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Helen. My throat tightened instantly. I set my coffee down before my hands could spill it. The envelope looked untouched. No fingerprints. No folds. Nothing. Which meant nobody else had opened it after Richard died. Slowly, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper smelled faintly like cedar and old cologne. Richard always kept stationery inside the desk for handwritten notes because he believed important things deserved ink instead of screens. My beautiful Helen, if you are reading this, then it means I did not get the extra time with you I prayed for. I stopped reading for a moment and closed my eyes. Even after 2 years, seeing his words still felt like hearing his voice unexpectedly in another room. Outside the office windows, morning light slowly brightened across the lawn. I continued reading carefully. I know you trust people easily when you love them. That is one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But promise me something. Do not sign anything quickly after I am gone, especially if someone pressures you to simplify matters. Richard had underlined the last sentence twice. My heartbeat slowed strangely as cold realization settled deeper into my chest. Beneath the letter sat another folder labeled Whitmore Family Trust in Richard's handwriting. I opened it carefully. Page after page revealed financial documents, property records, and legal instructions I had never seen before. But one sentence near the center of the trust agreement made my breath catch completely. Ownership of the Maple Ridge property remains solely under Helen Whitmore's protected trust authority until voluntarily transferred by written consent. I stared at the words for a very long time. Then slowly, I looked around the office again. The house, the renovations, the quiet humiliations, the careful attempts to make me feel temporary inside my own home. For the first time since Richard died, something stronger than grief began rising quietly inside me. Not rage, not revenge, awareness. And awareness, I would soon learn, is far more dangerous than sadness. For the next several days, I said almost nothing about what I found in Richard's office. I moved through the house exactly the way I always had. Quiet, careful, predictable. That was the advantage of being underestimated. People stop watching you closely once they decide you are powerless. Vanessa spent most of the week preparing for the upcoming charity gala scheduled for early December. Florists arrived carrying sample arrangements through the front hallway while delivery trucks unloaded rental chairs and linen catalogs onto the kitchen island. Every room slowly transformed into the kind of polished elegance Vanessa loved showing the world. White roses, gold candle holders, crystal glassware that reflected warm light across the dining room walls each evening. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. Wealthy, refined, stable. Inside the house, however, something had shifted quietly between Vanessa and me after the luncheon. Not openly, subtly. She spoke to me more carefully now, almost as though she sensed something changing beneath the surface. One afternoon, she found me sitting in Richard's old office reviewing a stack of handwritten recipes I had not touched in years. She stopped briefly in the doorway. "I did not realize you still came in here," she said lightly. "Sometimes," I answered without looking up. Vanessa crossed her arms gently. "I have been thinking maybe we should finally renovate this room after the holidays. Brighten it up a little." I closed the recipe box slowly before meeting her eyes. Richard liked it exactly the way it is. For one brief second, something unreadable flickered across her expression. Irritation, perhaps, or surprise. Then the polite smile returned immediately. "Of course," she replied softly. "I just want the house to feel current. Current, modern, polished." Her favorite words always sounded harmless until you realized they were really about removal. That evening, Ethan returned home unusually early from work while Vanessa met with event planners downtown. I heard him moving around the kitchen before eventually stopping near the office doorway. "Mom?" he asked gently. I looked up from Richard's desk. Ethan loosened his tie while leaning against the frame. He looked tired lately, older around the eyes. "Vanessa said you have been spending time in Dad's office again. Is that a problem?" He frowned immediately. "No, of course not." Silence settled briefly between us. Then he glanced around the room slowly. I still expect him to walk in sometimes, he admitted quietly. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I softened slightly. So do I. Ethan stepped farther inside and ran his hand along the bookshelf absent-mindedly. You know, he said after a moment. Vanessa has been stressed trying to keep everything together lately. The gala, the house, the kids. Sometimes she says things without meaning them harshly. I studied my son carefully across the dim office light. Even now he was protecting her instinctively. Not because he was cruel. Because believing difficult truths about someone you love requires a kind of courage many people never develop. Do you think I make things harder for her? I asked quietly. Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable. No, not harder. He hesitated. Just different. Different. Such a gentle word for displacement. Before I could answer, voices drifted through the open hallway from the front entrance. Vanessa had returned home earlier than expected. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor while she spoke on her phone. Once everything is finalized after the gala, she said casually, the property will finally function the way we intended. I felt Ethan stiffen slightly beside me. Vanessa had not realized we could hear her from the office. No more emotional complications, she continued with a light laugh. Trust me, it will feel like a completely new house. The hallway fell silent seconds later. Ethan stared toward the office doorway without speaking. Slowly, I watched confusion begin settling across his face for the very first time. Not complete understanding yet. Just the first crack appearing in something he had refused to question for years. He looked back toward me slowly. I said nothing. I did not need to. Because once people hear cruelty clearly with their own ears, silence becomes far more powerful than accusation. December arrived with freezing rain and bare trees lining Maple Ridge Drive like dark skeletons against the winter sky. Inside the house, however, everything glowed with artificial warmth. The charity gala was only 2 days away, and Vanessa had transformed every corner of the property into something that looked ready for a magazine cover. Tall white orchids stood beside the staircase. Gold candles flickered across mirrored trays in the dining room. Even the piano Richard played every Christmas now held framed photographs of Vanessa and Ethan smiling beneath soft professional lighting. None of the older family pictures had returned. I noticed that quietly. I noticed everything now. On the morning before the gala, a garment bag arrived from a designer boutique downtown. Vanessa carried it upstairs personally while speaking excitedly into her phone about guest lists and press coverage from the local charity magazine. I remained downstairs in the breakfast room reviewing trust documents I had carefully copied from Richard's office over the past week. Every page confirmed the same thing. The house belonged entirely to the protected family trust under my authority. Vanessa had no legal claim to the property at all. Neither did Ethan unless I transferred ownership willingly. Yet somehow, over the past 2 years, they had both begun behaving as though my presence there was temporary. As though I were slowly waiting to be moved aside. Around noon, Ethan entered the breakfast room holding his car keys loosely in one hand. He looked distracted, restless. Mom, he said carefully, can I ask you something? I folded the documents calmly before meeting his eyes. Of course. He hesitated for several seconds. Did Dad ever mention changing anything about the trust before he passed away? The question hung quietly between us. Outside the windows, snow began falling lightly across the backyard. Why are you asking now? Ethan exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck the same way Richard used to whenever he felt cornered emotionally. Because Vanessa keeps talking about restructuring things after the gala. Selling parts of the property, eventually. Renovating. His voice lowered slightly. But I realized this week I actually do not know what Dad arranged legally. I studied my son carefully. He looked genuinely unsettled now. Not angry. Not manipulative. Simply confused by truths arriving later than they should have. Your father arranged everything very carefully, I answered quietly. Ethan nodded once, staring down at the marble floor. Vanessa said she thought simplifying ownership would reduce stress for everyone. Simplifying ownership. Such elegant language for removing someone quietly. Before I could respond, Vanessa's voice drifted downstairs from the upper hallway. Ethan, can you come up here for a second? He glanced toward the staircase immediately. Habit. Instinct. Then he looked back at me with visible uncertainty lingering in his expression. We should probably talk. After the gala, he said softly before walking away. I watched him disappear upstairs while snow continued falling outside in delicate silence. Later that evening, after the decorators finally left, I walked alone through the ballroom tent installed across the back terrace overlooking the yard. Crystal chandeliers hung above round tables covered in white linen and gold-trimmed china. A jazz quartet would perform there tomorrow night, while wealthy donors sipped champagne beneath heated lamps and complimented Vanessa on her perfect event planning. I moved slowly between the tables until I reached the center of the room. For a moment, I simply stood there listening to the silence surrounding me. Then my eyes drifted toward the grand staircase visible through the glass doors leading back inside the house. I remembered carrying Ethan down those same stairs one Christmas morning when he was 7 years old because he was too excited to walk properly after seeing snow outside. Richard laughed so hard, he nearly dropped the video camera recording us. Memories remained inside houses long after people stopped honoring them. "There you are," Vanessa said suddenly behind me. I turned calmly. She stood near the terrace entrance wearing tailored cream slacks and holding a clipboard against her chest. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. "Tomorrow is going to be important for our future," she said softly while glancing around the decorated space proudly. "Our future. Not yours. Not the family's. Ours." I looked at her for a long moment beneath the chandelier light reflecting softly across the tent walls. Then I smiled politely. "Yes," I said quietly. "I believe it will be." And for the first time since Richard died, I no longer felt invisible standing inside my own home. Snow covered the edges of Maple Ridge Drive by the evening of the gala, soft white layers glowing beneath rows of golden lights wrapped around the trees outside the house. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway while valets hurried through the cold carrying umbrellas for guests arriving in cashmere coats and polished leather shoes. Inside, the ballroom tent shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers while waiters moved gracefully between tables balancing silver trays filled with champagne glasses. Vanessa stood near the entrance greeting donors with effortless elegance, her ivory gown catching the candlelight every time she turned. She looked exactly like the kind of woman magazines describe as flawless, confident, sophisticated, untouchable. I remained upstairs until nearly 7 o'clock listening quietly as the house filled with music and conversation below. Through the bedroom window, snow continued falling gently over the backyard Richard once spent entire summers landscaping himself. I opened the garment bag hanging beside the closet door and carefully removed the midnight blue gown Richard bought me 25 years earlier before a charity auction in New York. The fabric remained timeless, simple, elegant. I ran my fingers slowly across the sleeves before dressing carefully in front of the mirror. When I finished, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Not because I looked younger. Because for the first time in years, I no longer looked invisible. Downstairs, conversations softened slightly the moment I entered the ballroom. Not dramatically, just enough for people to notice. Several guests turned politely while jazz music drifted through the chandeliers overhead. Vanessa froze near the center table when she saw me descending the staircase slowly with one hand resting lightly against the railing. Her smile faltered almost invisibly before returning again. "Helen," she said brightly once I reached the bottom step. "You look lovely." I smiled calmly. "Thank you." Ethan stood nearby holding a champagne glass. For a brief second, he looked startled seeing me dressed in the gown. Then something softer crossed his face. Recognition perhaps. Memory. Because his father used to look at me exactly the same way during events like this. As the evening continued, donors mingled beneath warm lights while auction items filled the far side of the tent beside towering floral arrangements. Around 8 o'clock, a distinguished older man entered through the terrace doors accompanied by 2 board members from the Whitmore Foundation. Conversations shifted immediately once. Guests recognized him. Charles Pembroke, chairman of the foundation Richard's grandfather established nearly 80 years earlier. Vanessa hurried forward gracefully to greet him. "Mr. Pembroke," she said warmly while extending her hand. "Welcome. We are honored you could attend." But Charles barely glanced at her before his eyes settled on me across the ballroom. His entire expression softened instantly. "Helen Whitmore," he said with genuine affection. "There you are." The room quieted subtly as he crossed directly toward me. He kissed my cheek gently before stepping back with a smile. "Your husband would be proud seeing this house tonight." Vanessa's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly nearby. Helen rarely attends events these days, she explained smoothly. We have all been encouraging her to reconnect socially. Charles looked confused for a moment. Rarely attends? He turned toward the surrounding guests with mild surprise. My dear, Helen practically built this foundation beside Richard for decades. Several donors exchanged glances quietly. I remained calm, silent. Charles continued warmly. Most people in this room are here tonight because of the Whitmore family trust she still oversees personally. Vanessa's face lost color so subtly most people would not have noticed it immediately. But I did. Ethan did too. Silence spread carefully through the ballroom beneath the soft music still playing in the background. Charles smiled kindly at me again. Richard always said the heart of this